Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi. The Chinese and the Taiwan, of course, the struggle continues, and there's a lot of news if you look at it one way, and there's a lot of news if you look at the other way as well. One has to analyze between the lines to realize what exactly is going to happen or what exactly is happening in the region of Taiwan. Of course, the US, the politicians within the US are supposed to be visiting Taiwan, and that's presumed to be uh, one of the factors that may just increase the temperature of the region a little bit. To discuss this, I have someone special with me, Mr. Aadil Brar, who is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Taiwan, a fellow who's based in Taipei itself. So we'll get a little bit of an insight what's happening within Taiwan and what do people actually think over there. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Adi. Thanks for inviting me. It's a very important topic, and I think we should definitely discuss this because a lot of people in India are closely watching what goes on in Taiwan right now. So we should definitely talk about it.
Absolutely, it's been a sense of interest since especially the Ladakh issue started up. Uh, I want to take your perspective to begin with. What exactly is China trying to do in Taiwan? Because on the face of it, they pretty much mention a status quo ante and push down of the pro-independence forces. So that, and of course, a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. That is part two of the game. But the first thing they want to keep is let it be the same way. Is that a good assessment, or is it more towards the, peaceful reunification they're focused on?
Let me start by saying that a lot of the conversation which we have in India on Taiwan is still kind of focused on what the Western media talks about. So we in India, unfortunately, have not yet developed kind of the capability or knowledge base to study Taiwan or the region well enough to kind of make our own prediction. So a lot of our media and our intelligentsia kind of rely on Western media, so we keep on coming across these, predictions about, 2025 is when Beijing will move on Taiwan, 2027. And all these kind of predictions and assessments are based on military capability. And it's usually the US Army looking at the Chinese capability, their military preparedness, if they're able to invade and kind of conduct this marine operation, which is a very complex operation. So it's based on that assessment and capability rather than an assessment of intention, which is very difficult to come by, especially in case of China, the Chinese politics, which is a black box. So it's hard to predict what is going on and what will eventually happen, even within the medium and the short, long term. So it's difficult to predict these things. And I think that's where your question really gets at, why Beijing is saying what they're saying and what do they want right now. I think this idea that they want to maintain status quo in the form that as it exists is somewhat true. But they are not the only party in this game. There's Taiwan itself, there's the US, which have their own interest and which have their own understanding of what status quo really means. So Beijing has come to a conclusion that they may not be able to kind of restore the status quo that had existed before 2016 when President Tsai Ing-wen became the president of Taiwan. So there is this new understanding, which is my own assessment, that Beijing wants to um, at least control Taiwan in a certain way that they don't have to, let Taiwan become an independent country. So these are the kind of the red lines that exist. So one of the red lines is that Taiwan should not declare independence. Taiwan should not have regular ties with the US. So it's trying to stop these very strategic initiatives that Taiwan and US are currently engaged in, and Beijing is witnessing that it's becoming harder and harder by the day for them to stop these engagements from happening. And the other aspect, which is the second aspect, that's the elections in Taiwan. So the elections in Taiwan are coming up in 2024, and there is one aspect which Beijing really keeps in mind when it comes to Taiwan. That is the internal influencing of the population. So Beijing wants to influence the internal politics in Taiwan. So that's where this whole conversation about stopping Taiwan from declaring independence and developing ties with the US comes in. So Beijing wants to make sure that if the ruling DPP, which is primarily pro-independence, though they don't say that out loud, but we know for a fact a lot of these leaders within the TPP have that stance, and Beijing wants to make sure the opposition KMT is either able to come into power, which will be the ideal scenario, or they are able to win enough votes so that the local perception about this kind of flow, which is ongoing right now between Taipei and Washington, of exchanges, visits, and we know for a fact that President Tsai Ing-wen is about to go to the U.S., which is again a big event. Um, Previously, there was conversation about the U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy coming to Taipei, but that trip has now been delayed, but he might visit in the future. So Beijing is playing this kind of multiplayer game where they are trying to influence Taipei, trying to deter the US, and also now regional players like Japan and Philippines, which also realize that they have equal stake in this geopolitical game that's playing out in their immediate neighborhood.
The interesting part about Taiwan is that without control of Taiwan, if you look at it as far as trade or influence is concerned, Beijing still has a stumbling block in the South China Sea. So the control, or the, I won't say full physical control, but pro China lenient Taiwan would be preferable for them, so that it does not pose a certain threat militarily, trade wise, and whole other things. Which is what brings me to a point which talks about the factor that when the Chinese put across their, they've been talking about this one country, two systems, and this and that. And we know for a fact that there is a little bit of a rethink in the wordings or in the perception of this one country, two systems game. This was brought out by Wan Huning back in the day, and now he's again back in the Taiwan Affairs Office. A lot of people talk about a change of that phrase. Is there any conversation within Taiwan about this? That will there be a change of direction by the Chinese to achieve the same goal?
Um, so talking about the perceptions within Taiwan, there are few different views right now which kind of explain what's going on within Taiwanese society. There's one aspect which is, what happened in Russia-Ukraine war. For the first time, the Taiwanese are talking about, a potential invasion, which looks likely because one country, a sovereign country, invaded another sovereign country, which has not been heard for some time at least. Though it has happened, I wouldn't say it not really happened in the last 2 decades, but it has not happened at the scale that we are witnessing right now. So Taiwanese closely watched that event. They were not, they're quite kind of shocked when they saw what happened in Europe. So that's one conversation that is happening. The other conversation is um, kind of the old population, which is concerned about the current politics by DPP, which leans towards a pro-US perspective, and they are leaning towards a, if not independence, but better ties, more diplomatic ties with countries. And that particular population is concerned because they believe the ruling party might be kind of pushing Taiwan towards a war with their activities rather than maintaining the status quo. And then there is a somewhat of a third perspective, which is also a significant group of people that believe China will never do it. They believe that they've been talking about it for 80 years, and all this talk shop or geopolitics is just going to continue, and Taiwan will remain the way it is, but it will lose diplomatic allies, and in the current scenario it will suffer a bit, but not as much, and likely remain the way things are. So these are broadly the three perspectives in Taiwan right now, and that these three perspectives are driving the electoral politics as well. So the KMT, which is the opposition, has gained quite a bit of support from all these different groups, and they are now a big opposition that can even challenge the ruling DPP. And so, what Beijing is doing is through their activities, through military activities, through crossing the median line, or talking about taking these remote islands, which are closer to the mainland, Matsu and Kinmen. So they are talking about um, either doing activities which sends a message to the population that we are not that far, and which can again become like a psychological operation that influences the outcome of the election. So Beijing is engaging in these very tightly planned sort of psychological operations. And if you were talking about Wang Huning being in charge of the somewhat of a leading small group, so there are these small groups where leaders discuss amongst themselves, what should be China's foreign policy stance. The actual person who's in charge of the Taiwan Affairs Office is Song Tao. He's a veteran diplomat who was brought into this position, and he's met some of the leaders of KMT, as well as Wang Huning also was part of these meetings. So again, a kind of a psychological operation by Beijing to influence local politics in Taiwan, because people here do talk about these things and they read the news. They talk about, oh look, Beijing is not really talking about military operation. They're talking about having contact and ties. And if you read the news recently, Taiwan has decided to restore flights to mainland to 13 cities so far, and it's going to be 23 cities very soon. And which has happened since 2016. Actually, the flights were shut, and this decision has been made by the ruling DPP. So the DPP again is caught in this internal politics where they cannot, take up this very kind of strong rhetoric of cutting ties with mainland, growing close to the US, because that will cost them elections. So Beijing actually might even be gaining in the current environment, gaining the targets that they've set for Taiwan.
That is what confuses a lot of people. The opening of flights, there was a very, I mean, I won't call it interesting, but very weird news that came out last night that from one of these islands there was a soldier that went missing, and he was found at in the mainland. He basically either defected or just ran away, or I don't know what it was. There was a news about Taiwanese missiles going into China for some repair, some parts of missiles and stuff like that. So when you see all this and you see that, it's, I think, a very difficult thing to understand for people who don't know that there are a lot of ethnic ties that both the areas have. They probably have families and they're married across the strait as well. You were speaking, and I'd like you to comment on that first before I actually get into the islands that you mentioned.
Yeah, so the opposition KMT and the kind of vote bank that they represent, these are called blue families, or sort of pro-blue groups, and they are the kind of individuals or vote bank that has asked for better ties with mainland, because
Yeah.
they have family ties and they have business ties, and they are opposed to the kind of politics that the ruling DPP represents. Um, and and even now, if you look at there's a lot of reporting on this. Chinese mainland is actually promoting immigration by Taiwanese to mainland. But this is again a kind of united front activity by Beijing, influencing local population, influencing sentiment and psychology. So these things continue simultaneously. So we can't really say that these are kind of opposed, and Beijing's strategy that seems like out of balance. These are pretty much aligned in a sense that they want to maintain maximum military pressure, because that achieves a psychological, a signaling target, signaling to the local population, as well as signal to another set of vote bank and local population that, oh look, we are actually requesting more ties. We are looking for starting flights. We are looking for more economic ties, because if you look at the 1992 consensus and there were agreements which were signed between the mainland and Taiwan in 2008, when both the offices opened for exchanges between Taiwan and mainland, when they restored their ties. Um, Beijing's primary target or strategic vision was to entangle Taiwanese businesses into this arrangement where they become so independent on the mainland, which is still quite the case, that their politics or whatever internal politics, it doesn't really matter because they are so entangled. Their economics becomes so entangled that they cannot disentangle from that. It's only because of COVID, these relations kind of became difficult. First, when President Tsai Ing-wen came into power, then COVID, and these factors have moved Taiwan away from mainland, into establishing more business ties with Southeast Asia, which was kind of growing, but it has allowed Taiwan to do more of that. And so Beijing knows that long-term kind of peaceful reunification that it talks about can only happen by economic ties. If people-to-people ties and economic ties are strong, then it's unlikely that the ruling party in Taiwan will be able to declare independence, because that is the red line that Beijing wants to avoid by any means. Um, so if you look at the recent conversation in the two sessions that happened, they talk about people to people ties. They talk about Taiwan patriots and bringing them into motherland. So that rhetoric continues, and they are investing more into helping the opposition do its bidding in Taipei.
The interesting thing is, it sounds like a good old good cop, bad cop routine. Uh,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
yeah, talking about these islands, you also spoke about a psychological this thing. Of course, I've kind of had some conversations with some military experts who don't put in too much of military heat into what I'm going to say, but they do agree that it will be quite a psychological blow to the efforts. And the median line itself has been drawn out by the West, which is kind of somewhat accepted by the US. And it's a very clear thing that any action on the Taiwan side of the median line would be a red line, which leaves the guys on the other side a little vulnerable. And if the Chinese are actually able to do some sort of a activity, if I may, on these particular islands, may it be military, may it be social, whatever, some sort of a control activity on this island, it may just be a huge morale blow to the current ruling dispensation within Taiwan, bringing about the factor that, listen, you guys are too small to affect a lot of things. Would that change the view on the ground to the way that the Chinese would hope it would in terms of a scaremongering setup, or would it harden the stance of the mainland Taiwan and the people in Taiwan who would see it as a betrayal?
Um, I think it can go both ways. It really depends. The timing matters when Beijing decides to, if they want to do something like that. Before I get to it, let's talk about the whole median line, which has become difficult to maintain. Beijing continues to cross it regularly. And the fact is that once, let's say, PLA gets cross median line, it's only about 6 to 9 minutes before they're over Taipei. And that is starting something which is irreversible. So if we look at what has been happening lately since the whole Pelosi visit, Beijing has consistently crossed that line, which is to send a message that we are not that far. So it's not just those islands, it's the median line becoming almost blurry and non-existent, which is equally part of this signaling effort, um, which I prefer as a term over salami slicing. So because salami slicing assumes that Beijing is trying to take some territory, these islands. I don't think they are, because those are not really useful as a strategy for Beijing, because they can really take them anytime if they want to. But it will have to be the timing and the outcome which influences Taiwanese population. That itself will be important when Beijing does it. Um, and I would say somewhat they've been doing it already by crossing the median line so regularly, which never used to be the case, through ships and aircraft. So the island activity would be a last minute resort when Beijing sees that they're not really achieving these goals that they've set for themselves. So I don't think anytime soon that is going to happen, because at least for now, the DPP seems to be the ruling party in Taiwan seems to be changing its position on its stance on ties with the US. They do want to conduct these visits, but they don't seem to be moving towards declaring independence or anything. So for now, Beijing seems to be okay with how things are going. But if anything changes in 6 months from right now, things could potentially escalate. Taking these islands. But we should look at what's happening on a daily basis, which is equally more concerning. Crossing the line at the same time as seeking ties. So it's like a dual strategy, dual signaling strategy, which seeks to influence public opinion, not only in Taiwan, but also globally as well. We should not ignore the fact that Beijing doesn't think about other Asian countries in the region or rest of the world. They do definitely think about what happens in Taiwan does um, eventually sends a signal about US capabilities in Asia.
I talk about that because the way the war in Ukraine has been handled, if you look at it from a little bit of a further perspective, from not from a humanitarian ground, but just from a very, very basic military sense, probably the Taiwanese would. That's one of the reasons I see a lot of rethink in terms of the strategy that the Taiwanese want to talk about. But the big question I want to ask you before that is the factor that when the Taiwanese people actually see what's happening, and there is a factor of fear, or there's a factor of uh, unknowingness, if I may, not knowing what the next move may be. Uh, because one thing is for sure, if anything does happen, the setup in Taiwan is going to shake really hard. Uh, the social life, the structure of Taiwan, the cities, is going to get shaken up. What is the consideration amongst people when you talk about it? Is it strongly saying that we don't care, we can rebuild, but this is not going to happen? Or is it that, okay, if we are stuck in that bad a position, then we need to see what to do to kind of preserve? What
Hmm.
is the kind of a mood within the population?
Yeah, there are quite a few concerns. So, first of them is supply of energy for Taiwan. Taiwan is still dependent on energy supplies on the rest of the world. They have some of their own, but they do depend on, which is a major issue in Taiwan right now. They're talking about restoring nuclear plants to generate
Yeah.
electricity so that they can become independent in terms of if tomorrow Beijing decides to conduct such an activity, they should be able to handle the situation. And similarly, food supplies. In terms of food, I think they are somewhat independent. They have the local enough supply to kind of sustain the population, but for how long? And then the other kind of elephant in the room is the whole semiconductor business, which is Taiwan's strong capability, which again will also influence and impact Beijing's own activities, because even mainland does depend on Taiwan for some of these key semiconductor supplies, and it's becoming even harder to get by these semiconductor supplies because of the sanctions that US has imposed. And again, that becomes an activity that deters Beijing from um, acting out in a brash manner. But people do hear talk about these things, and they want to prepare in a way that they can sustain for the long run. But societally, I don't think that move is really happening. It's kind of stuck in this politics where the buck keeps getting passed on, because it's a democracy. So somewhat similar situation in other countries as well. Um, the present dispensation was supposed to reform the military training, and they've not been able to do so, and they're getting blamed for that in the local press. So, somewhat similar tensions do exist in other countries as well as in Taiwan, where the people have started talking about this. They are talking about um, preparing for a scenario, but a large set of population still believes that they can rely on the US, which is a sentiment that has become consolidated in the past months because of what is going on in Ukraine. They think that if America doesn't come directly to their help, they'll supply enough weapons to deter um, Beijing. But we also don't know how much the population will really fight back. There are different statistics about it. Some Surveys say most of the population will pick up arms and start resisting. There's also surveys which show that some set of population will not really do that. Um, so these surveys are have contradictory information depending on the sample size and who they ask these questions. So I wouldn't say there is one clear consensus on what will really happen. And this is what people, when I talk to people here, they say we actually don't know how will people respond. Nobody really knows for sure. Um, how will people respond? There will be resistance in certain cities, but we can't really assume that it's going to be like Ukraine, where everybody kind of comes together and they start fighting back. Only time will tell.
A US help is, which is what I mean. You've kind of driven me into this particular question. Is that there are two ways of looking at the help that US has given. One is that the US has provided for the means for the Ukrainians to fight. Uh, that made easier with the land border and pretty much secure land border within NATO territory. Uh, Taiwan would be very difficult to do, considering what kind of a blockade that these guys had done after Pelosi's visit. That's one way of looking at it. The second way of looking at it is the fact that the US will physically come and help Taiwan. Now, the strategic ambiguity policy that the US kind of keeps on, uh, when there's not much word from it. I don't know if there is personal word that has been given to President Tsai or not. That's not apart from this. What do the people look at it? I mean, is the practicality of the ability of the US and the West supplying Taiwan with the kind of weapons that they were able to do to Ukraine, uh, and understanding that the people have that it's going to be difficult. Whatever said and done is going to be very difficult. Uh, the US would have to put in its own assets to secure pathways to go inside Taiwan and make sure the weapons are dropped and stuff. It's quite a dangerous activity. How do people react to the fact that there is quite a bit of ambiguity with regards to what the US would do in case the balloon does go up?
Yeah. See, people who read these things on a daily basis would know the nuances better, but when it comes to the general population, they might not be so informed about how capable US is to supply these weapons, though they are, I mean, they are so stretched out right now in Ukraine, and they want to supply Taiwan with asymmetric capabilities. And there's been some reporting which suggests that Taiwan is not exactly happy right now with how much weapons they are getting, things they're paid for already, because US is behind on their delivery schedule. So these things does influence, impact the local perception. So leaving aside the general population, what they think that US will. There's a large chunk of people who does believe that US will come to their help because of what happened in Ukraine. They've started believing that. But what really the kind of think tanks and the experts are not sure. They think US will come for the help, but they also believe that the other countries like Japan can also be relied on. Japan has its own interests, so they're looking towards Japan for more help. Taiwan is reaching out to Japan more consistently than they has in the past years, because they see that Japan is now in their kind of documents, their national strategy, they're talking about Taiwan and how critical it is to their own national security, their own regional security. Um, so Taiwan is trying to develop this multiplayer strategy where they bring in the US, hopefully Japan, as well as other countries that can deter Beijing, because they see that this particular military expedition will have an impact on their economic interest and their regional security. It's trying to talk to these countries whenever it can, and that is why in Taiwan this the concept of Indo-Pacific really plays an important role, because it connects these hub and spoke systems in these regional security
Groupings.
interests.
Yeah.
And every seminar in Taiwan is right now about Indo-Pacific. It's even funny that some of the seminars about food are linked to Indo-Pacific, because that's where the kind of funding is going towards, by the foreign ministry here, by different institutions that are trying to bring in more countries, not just the US. So, to sum it up, I think there is some concern about how capable the US is because they are stretched out quite a bit. But I would say US is not just the only country in Taiwan's assessment when they reach out to other countries, but being such a regional player, they know they will need US one or the other way.
Indeed, there's no question about it. My last question to you is about the factor that, generally speaking, when you look at Beijing today, uh, 3 years ago, Beijing was a little more confident within their ability to do things, to have the economic might to be able to sustain uh, whatever they thought would be the repercussions. But when you look at the sanctions that were put on to Russia, whatever said and done, the Russians have a great big advantage with regards to a certain resilience within their economy and having a large scope of food as well as natural resources to back their uh, their standing, which the Chinese don't. Uh, that is a major weakness. Now, when you see that and combined with the slowdown within China, and it's not a periodic slowdown, a lot of people have now established the fact that this is how China is going to be, and it's not going to be like a collapse, like a lot of people like to mention. It's going to be a slow decline of China. Do you think or foresee any rush from the Chinese to kind of say, okay, we can do this when we are up? We won't be able to do anything 10 years down the line where we are going to be not in the position where we are today. And a rethink that we are not as resilient as Russia in terms of our resources, in terms of our supply chains and stuff like that. So, what do we do? What do you think the Chinese are thinking about in this particular way if they need to actually take some action on Taiwan?
That's a very good question, which doesn't get asked as much. It's about capability, not just the number of weapons you have, but fighting the business of war, food security. And China has been talking about food security regularly. If you read some of the recent, documents, including the meetings of the Politburo, um, there is discussion about ensuring food security. And the reason I would say China is talking about food security as well as natural resource self reliance is because they know that it cannot just think about not fighting these wars. These wars are likely to happen. They have to prepare for them. They have to prepare for all kind of scenarios. So food security is one of the very important topics right now that China is discussing. It's up there with economic concerns as well as technological self-reliance. It just doesn't get discussed as much in media because some other headlines overshadow it. And the reason why China is doing what it is doing in the Middle East is linked to its energy interest in the region because it has to bring in these supplies of hydrocarbon and other resources, and that's why it's working with Russia. Beijing is working with Russia to build the power of Siberia too, so it can be comfortable with natural resource supplies. So it is working on Beijing is working on preparing for some kind of scenario, and that is why when the U.S. Army chiefs talk about Beijing preparing for war, they look at these kind of data. This is my own opinion. These are the kind of data they look at. These are the kind of you know data point that they visit when they try to assess is Beijing trying to start a war, because when Russia did something similar with Ukraine, America was able to predict that war beforehand based on their sources and other assessments. And I think similarly, America is doing something similar with Beijing as well. So we can't say that Beijing is not thinking about um, these complex topics like how to fight a war, how to sustain a population, how to operate as a economy with pretty much no ties, because that is going to happen. Beijing will have fewer allies, though we can't say they'll have no allies. They will have allies because um, international politics and international relations in the current context is very operates in a very real manner. Realism is the
Yeah.
new game in the business. So we can't really say that all the countries will all of a sudden cut off ties with Beijing. So it's trying to ensure with this diplomacy, with the diplomatic strategy that Beijing has right now to have enough allies if it has to fight such a scenario. So food security, natural resource dependence, and a diplomatic strategy. All three strategies that Beijing is trying to pursue are geared towards preparing for something in the future, if not right now, down the line. But we, most of the experts, if you talk to, nobody will tell you that a date has been set. And so
Hmm.
we should not waste our time in trying to predict the date.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather look at the sort of the gears as they shift and as these developments happen.
Absolutely. Even if it is said, I think the last people they will tell is us.
Yes, indeed.
Jokes apart. But thanks so much. You've put in a little bit of a different perspective with regards to what's happening within Taiwan. Uh, for a lot of people, that's a bit of a mystery because at the end of it, I feel it's very important for us to study Taiwan to understand what the game is because at the end of it, you're trying to look at it from a otherwise very idealistic perspective. Oh,
Exactly. Yeah.
China, big country, Taiwan, small country. China should not attack Taiwan. Fair enough, but there's a lot more to it, uh, which needs to be understood with regards to the internal situation of Taiwan, the internal feeling of Taiwan, the people within Taiwan. Because, as you said, there's a large segment of population, not a large, but a significant segment of the population which says, "Yeah, just cool it, relax. Let's not, get into a conundrum over things. Let's not escalate situations. We've done well till now. Let it go the way it is." This is a perspective that is not known to people, especially in India. Especially again, I would say most of the West does not know about this because
Yeah,
either they
because it
know or
kind
they
of
choose to
contradicts
ignore
a
it.
lot
I
of
guess.
perspectives, right? It doesn't add into the narrative of
Narrative.
promoting democracy and these kind of very funny ideas, though they matter. I'm not saying they don't.
No, no, I get
But
your context.
sense in the context of kind of hard military power, these assessments have to take into account what people really think here in Taiwan.
Absolutely. And that's something, again, a lot of people, in my opinion, missed in terms of Eastern Ukraine because a lot of them are pro Russians. So
Mhm.
today there are reports coming out where the Ukrainian themselves are saying, yeah, the people that are staying here are giving up positions to the Russians because these guys are Russians. Because this is
Yeah,
happening, and there's a perception which has been completely missed from the narrative, as you said, uh,
mhm.
which is something I guess the world should not make as a mistake when you're analyzing Taiwan. Taiwan is a free country. It's a free people. They have their rights to think and decide what they want to do with themselves. So I guess that's one
Exactly.
of the
And
things.
I'll highly recommend everybody should watch and read what's going on in Taiwan with the elections, because that will have not just an impact on Taiwan and Beijing, but I think East Asia security,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
again
yeah,
has an implication for India as well.
absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that perspective out, and I hope to keep in touch with you for a lot more perspectives coming out of Taiwan in the future, and try and see if we can make people and me and people watching understand what the game is and actually be a little more pragmatic than emotional about the
Thank you,
situation.
Adi. This was a great
Thank you so much.
conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.